great honor to speak here today. I'm going to talk about living on the edge. And I want to put kind of a global perspective on this in the end, but I'm going to start off first with my personal story. And see if we get this thing going. Never trust technology. Copy me there in the back there. Living on the edge here without any focus.
There we go.
You got her there? Okay, great. This is where it all began for me. My father was fought in World War II in the South Pacific, and I was born or conceived on leave. When he came back from the war, he started his own business, raised a family of 9 kids by his ideas. We were raised in this house here in Richfield. 6 boys. We were called the dormitory, in one room upstairs. And we were given almost total freedom as young kids to follow our dreams. We had very little rules. We had to maintain a certain grade point average, stay out of trouble with the law. If we wanted to, we were free to do whatever we wanted to do, but we had to pay for it. And as a young kid, I was really like most young kids. I was programmed. I loved the wilderness, had a deep concern always for nature or the environment. And I had this vocation for education. It was a seed. And I started by climbing. I always wanted to climb mountains. And this was very unusual for a kid in the 50s in Richfield, Minnesota. In fact, there was no REI stores, nowhere you can get equipment. So I bought a rope out of the hardware stores, checked a book out of the Minneapolis Public Library. And from there, I started to learn. We started to do traverses on the North Shore. And my goal was really to get into high mountains. I was very interested in what's called mountaineering. Not so much rock climbing was a means to an end for me. But it was through the climbing that when I was 16, 17, I got on my edge. In other words, I got to that point where I had to be at my absolutely total best, physically, mentally, spiritually. Not that these are all 3 compartments, but I had to be the best in myself. And I kind of transcended that through a moment when I was 16, my first lead climb, through a moment of terror when I just all of a sudden got it together and realized and relaxed and lived in this present moment. And what I experienced there was really quite profound. What I experienced was that there was no security on the edge. Most everyone, all of us, we have a life where we seek security in our jobs, our relationships, when actually security is kind of an illusion. But in the edge is living in the present moment. It's living intuitively and through feeling, where the logical mind that we live on from day to day doesn't factor in too much. First of all, the logical mind is very compartmentalized. It's very slow when you have to make instant decisions. In fact, I learned to make most of my decisions through my feeling, through intuition. I seldom have to think about, sometimes will have to weigh things, but my actual decisions I learned are through the feeling. And what I learned on the rock, I really start bringing to life as a young teenager. And with this goal of going into higher mountains, I had to, again, increase my skills. By the time I was 18, I was doing overhangs. And then when I was 19, I was in the Canadian Rockies. And when I was 20 years old, I was in the Peruvian Andes. I was very fortunate to connect with some good climbers and did a number of first ascents over 20,000 feet. But what I was learning, I was able to apply now more in my everyday life. Being a Minnesota kid, I was very inspired by the North, by canoeing. And particularly, I was interested in kayaking. And this is when I was 19 years old, leaving in Jasper, Alberta in the southern Canadian Rockies. Early June, beginning of a 3,000-mile kayak trip. We kayaked up all the way to the Arctic Ocean, where we crossed the mountains, the Richardson Mountains, the northern extension of the Rockies, and then paddled down into Alaska to Fairbanks in order to hitchhike back to get back to my sophomore year of college. And the whitewater experience, I traveled in my later teens, earlier 20s. I traveled over 10,000 miles in the north. And again, to travel in this area, you really had to have the skills. And you really had to live in that moment a lot of times. And And that led me to the wilderness north of Ely, where when I was 19, I bought wilderness land in a roadless area, 3 miles, 2 lakes from the nearest road. And at 19, I started building my home here, where I still live. And I moved after I had my college experiences, my master's in education and 3 years of teaching. I moved up to Ely when I was 25 to make my living there. And in order to support myself, I started a dog sledding and skiing school. And this was the beginning of my dog sled experience. This was my first puppy that I ever had. Again, I didn't know anything about dog sledding. I'd never been on a dog sled before, but I learned. The dogs actually, I leased out 4 dogs. I learned more from them than anyone else. And I built up the school that I ran, and it was through the dogs. And I ran a number of courses. This is a group of medical students from the St. Luke's Hospital. They wanted to learn about hypothermia. So I took them out on the Basswood River. Notice the poles there. And it was a controlled situation, but they learned about hypothermia, and they still talk about it today. And it definitely was not textbook learning. But once I had a good dog team together, I returned to the Arctic. And there I had a career of over 25 years, first in the Arctic and then the North Pole and the polar regions, traveling by dogs and leading international teams, which was really an incredible experience. But all along, ever since I was young, I studied the climate. In fact, I taught global warming in my classes in the late 60s, and one of my students is in the back running the projectors right now. And I was very much aware of global warming, although back in the 60s, it was a concept. And you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, burning of fossil fuels, the Earth's going to warm, but we had no idea that this would accelerate. But I was on this edge of the melting ice in both polar areas throughout my career. I knew it was coming. I had no idea, like everyone else, that it would be so fast. This was an expedition of 6 people from 6 countries that I led across Antarctica in 1989-90. We crossed this is the Larsen Ice Shelf, which I'll talk about in a minute here. This is kind of the story of my life in a way, is that beyond this mountain range was a total unknown. 3,500 miles of this route had never been traveled on in the winter. Some had never been traveled on at all. And we set out to do this crossing. And there we go. This is the route that we took, the longest possible route. And I always think the really long way. And this is the only route I ever thought about doing because it was the longest one. And the very top of the route there is the northern part of the Antarctic Peninsula, where you see the arrow there, 350 miles. That's the Larsen Ice Shelf. Minnesota fits in right into the center of where the yellow line is. And I want to show you some video of us landing there, and I want to talk a little bit about, show you the expedition and so forth. And get this going. Yeah, there's no sound in the beginning here. This is the Larsen Ice Shelf. When we first saw it, it was the largest land feature I'd ever seen. I'd never seen anything this large. It went on and on and on. We're flying into it here because we were going to land and start the expedition at the northernmost tip. It's about 700 feet thick. Over 150 feet of it's above water here. The scientists believe that this was laid down during the last ice age 12,000 years ago, and it survived all the warming ages that we had until 2002. And as we flew across the perimeter of here, it was just pretty awesome. Yes. And this is the first moment of the expedition here. You notice the really good trained dogs here.
Sit, sit, whoa, whoa, whoa there, guys.
This is what the dogs are trained for. They have this enthusiasm, and we would travel for 25 years. I did teams of 6 with 3 dog teams, and each team has 10 dogs in it, pulling a load of about 1,200 pounds. And these dogs were specially bred, Eskimo cross. They're right at home at 30, 40 below zero. And they have this racing spirit, so real enthusiastic. A lot of them are pretty wild dogs, and we socialize them with young children, actually, when they're younger, if they are that way. But you can see they're socialized with people very well, and they also just love the cold. They're bred for this pulling and traveling with people like this on teams. And this is on the Larsen, this is July 15th, and this is equivalent to our middle of January. It was still 24 hours. The sun was below the horizon. We would have about 5 hours of twilight and about 18 hours of darkness. And this is the Larsen Ice Shelf. Right on sea level, our weather was not too bad at the beginning. And as we got higher into the mountains, the weather changed. But we crossed a mountain range that was between the Larsen A and B ice shelves, the two ice shelves. And you can see the way we travel here. We're always on skis. And in fact, on the back of the sled, there isn't a place to ride. And you're always working with the dogs. You have this continual rapport with the dogs, as you'll see here.
Whoa! Got away. Whoa! Make sure they come. Keep in front. That's it. Keep in front, Victor. Keep in front, Victor. Whoa. Keep in front, Victor. Come on. Victor, come here, right here. Keep that close. I know. Now we have to go. Fast then. Will. Go. Look at you.
These are the crevasses that we had. We crossed about 12 mountain ranges. All the way through, we had about 600 miles of these crevasses, but the real challenges was the cold weather. Our average temperatures were 30 below, 30 mile an hour winds, but the average wind chills for 6 months was right around 80 below. It was this combination of super cold and the strong winds. I organized this with my partner, Jean-Louis Etienne, a French physician from Paris, France. Jean-Louis and I met in the middle of the Arctic Ocean in '86. We literally ran into each other, and that's where we put this expedition together. Jean-Louis was the diplomat that brought in the Soviet Union and China, and I organized the team, the dogs, the organization here in the States. And the combination of this here, we put it all together. We're on a very dangerous ice field here, crevasse field. We use these orange dog blankets that we put underneath the harness. The danger here is the dog falls in, they'll slip out of the harness. And this way it keeps the dog in the harness here. But five of the 6 of us had been climbed before. And we have a dog in a crevasse here, pretty dangerous situation. Trying to pull it out. Neither Victor my friend from the Soviet Union here, we're not roped in.
Okay. Grab his collar. Okay, go. Get his harness, No. Come on, Bobby. Get up here. Okay.
We didn't lose any dogs in crevasses, but again, you had to be on alert all the time. This is on the Larsen B ice shelf here. It's unusual because it wasn't windy, and the snow was on the ground instead of the air. It's about 50 below here, and you can get an idea here of the constant rapport you have back and forth with your dogs. And then we had about 60 days of storms on the peninsula. No one had ever traveled in this region in the wintertime. And unusually good day here, actually. We could see all 3 teams. And Victor on the Russian always skied in the front, kept the dogs interested. And
Good boy.
I want to flash back here then and show you the peninsula here again. This is the Larsen A and B ice shelf. We crossed this now in '89. It took us almost 30 days to cross this. And this picture here, as you can see, January 31st, 2002. The square you see is about a 150-mile section of that. And I'll show you a close-up of that this year. The ice shelf, the ocean is the dark color, would be on your right. And then the ice shelf is the whiter area with the kind of the black dots on it. What was unusual about this was summer of 2002 was a record warm summer down in Antarctica. You had the presence of water on this ice shelf for probably the first time in 12,000 years. As you know, Minnesota, once you get water on the ice, it changes the structure of the ice. And this did this in almost in a planetary scale. These lakes, water flowed down and started to change the structure on this. And then shortly after January 31st, the first large breakup of the shelf happened. And then over the next 4-week period, this entire ice shelf collapsed into the ocean. You can see it here, totally gone. And I remember reading this in the Minneapolis paper about a month later. It was in the 9th or 10th page, and it said Larsen Ice Shelf disintegrates. And that was actually my wake-up call. After that, I left my life in Ely. I started at the Steger Foundation at that time. But what does this mean here? With the ice shelf disintegrating, it basically holds back these ice shelves and large glaciers. Some of the longest glaciers in the world flow into this. We traveled on the Weyerhaeuser Glacier, 120 miles long. But without the ice shelf there, this ice now is rapidly going into the ocean and starting to see the sea level rise. And then this is the Greenland ice cap. Greenland is the second largest ice cap in the world. It's in the northern hemisphere. Many of you, if you've ever flown to Europe, especially the Scandinavian countries, you've flown over at the Arctic Circle right there. And this is Greenland right here. It's 1,600 miles across, north to south. I've traversed this with a team unsupported the 1,600 miles, and I also crossed east-west by kite skis in 07. But in 92 was an average year, pretty much. You can see the red area is the thawing area in summertime. In other words, the thaw levels went up to about 800 feet, a little below 1,000 feet here. This is 92. And then you look here in 2002, the thawing levels are up to about 4,000 feet. And notice how this accelerates. It's up here to 2005. And believe it or not, get this thing going, 2012, the thaw levels went right up to 10,400 feet, the very top of this. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that this 2 miles of ice is going to melt down in a short 2-month season, but you have a tremendous amount of water flowing off the Greenland right now. And that water, unfortunately, doesn't flow right on the surface. It goes right through the glacier and lubricates the bottom of the glaciers. And a lot of these glaciers now are moving 15 to 17 miles a day. And this is rapidly, all the shelf ice around Greenland in the last 7-8 years have totally disintegrated. It's almost all gone. Shelf ice is the ice that's frozen, it's floating but frozen into it. And then there's the Arctic Ocean. This is the top of the globe here, that hazy spot. The North Pole is on the very top. I spent almost 1,000 days on the sea ice in my career. And up until 2007, the majority of this, 80 to 90% of this would be snow and ice all the way through the summer. And when you have the summer season up there, it's 24-hour light for 5 months. And that icy surface would reflect all this energy off. But what's happening as that ice is melting, you get a darker surface of either land on the shore or the darker ocean, and you're starting to get absorption. And the Arctic Ocean looks like this. It's a real dynamic area. Moving ice, broken up. It's very, very treacherous and very difficult to travel across it. Pressure ridges that you have to go up and down, hundreds of these with very heavy sleds. And it was in the 90s that we started seeing the changes, the massive amount of open water. In fact, a lot of the expeditions I did, we actually ground truthed it. It's visible maybe from a satellite, but you really have to be on the ground to see it and to live through it here. And in the 90s, we crossed the Arctic Ocean in 95, tremendous amount of open water. It became extremely dangerous to cross the Arctic Ocean. Right now, it's impossible to reach the North Pole by dog team. That whole era is over because of the open water. The only way you can travel now is with a canoe sled, and even that has really changed. And in my wildest dreams, I never thought I'd ever see myself canoeing on the Arctic Ocean. And I have the sea ice here, conclude here. You can see in the top slide there, that would have been like in 1986, in the late 80s, normal years. Majority of the energy reflects off. The second to the top would be the 90s, when we start seeing this opening up. And then in 07, we had a major breakup. About 50% of the sea ice broke up in one summer season. And we're heading very rapidly to the bottom where you have an open ocean, which is it's a tipping point. You're going from reflective to absorptive. That's not 100%, that's a 200% shift of the energy balance. And that in turn melts the ice on the ice caps and is changing everything. Sea level rise. And I have a slide here to conclude here. You can see the years here. This would be the least amount of sea ice would be in September. You can see in the 80s it was pretty normal at that time. And you'll see around 90s it's starting to slip a little bit. And then come the turn of the century is when we start seeing some big changes happening. This is 07. This is like September. It looks just like this right now, actually. And now we're on very thin ice. I mean, it's not just the human species, but a life as we know it is really on that edge right now. And I wanted to show this to you because it's something you really have to have a fact check on exactly where we are. It's very easy to deny the situation that we are in right now. The rapid changes, it affects everything. Our health, invasive species, crowding as the sea level rises. The models have always been so horribly conservative that we get sort of a light taste. Politically at the beginning, they were very conservative because of the politics. But the sea level rise is going to happen a lot faster than you're looking at, 5, 6, 10 feet by the turn of the century. Everyone in this room, it's going to affect our lives. Two directions is mitigate. I mean, we can avoid the worst of the catastrophe by moving really rapidly into the clean energy economy. It's a whole opportunity as our whole infrastructure as we know it is changing. The economy will change. The upside of that is probably 10, 15 years, we're going to see fossil fuels disappearing. Coal plants in Minnesota will be gone within 15 years, I'll predict. Probably within that time, we're going to see electrical transportation that's recharged from renewables. Imagine our cities without fossil fuels. I mean, it's really dangerous being in our cities and breathing the air, especially if you're susceptible, your lungs. All this we'll have a clean environment in another 20 years. But in the meantime, we have technology on our side. We have to adapt to the changes that we're going to occur. And I really challenge you to look at this, because we're all on this edge together. It's one thing that I found out throughout my career, and that's the power of the human spirit, or what collectively we can do if we're all together on a certain thing, and especially through international cooperation. I always hang on to international cooperation. We get so cynical about the politics, what's going on in the country right now. Myself, I haven't listened to the radio or read anything for the last 5 months. I just tuned out of it, and I hear what's going on a little bit. But the rest of the world isn't this crazy. Europe, lots of Asia. I mean, we have a tendency that this whole world's falling apart. There's a lot more intelligence around than we think, and everybody's waiting for us to set the example, but we keep stumbling here in the politics of everything. But it's really us to first take a look at ourselves and to take on this challenge of being at our very best, and outwardly from our own influence of our mind and so forth to move ahead and find the solution. So I want to thank you here for having the time here to speak tonight. Bye-bye.